Greetings, Western Civ 2 students. I'm recording this on my iPad, so if it looks a little different, that's why. But our lecture today, I want to talk to you about the year 1968. 1968. 1968 was a horrible year. For pretty much everybody, everywhere, it is on the short list of the worst years of the 20th century for sure, and probably would rank up there on the big list of over the centuries. 1968 for America began on a very negative note in Vietnam. In Vietnamese culture, as in much of East Asia, the Lunar New Year, which begins in late January, is the big holiday of the year, the Lunar New Year. For them, it's like Christmas and New Year's Day for us rolled into one plus. People travel, they visit families. And that New Year in Vietnamese is called Tet, T-E-T with a circumflex over the E, Tet. In the Vietnam War, even since the days when they were fighting the French in the 40s and 50s, the communists had observed a ceasefire during Tet, during this period. And in Vietnamese culture, often celebrations go on for a full month during Tet. They had observed ceasefires in the past. But in 1968, they surprised everybody by not only not observing a ceasefire, but launching a massive offensive all over South Vietnam. Their goal was to stimulate revolution from the masses. Remember, they're communists, and they really believed that the average Vietnamese person hated the South Vietnamese government and wanted to rise up against them. Now, they were probably wrong in this. There were some people who supported the South Vietnamese government. There were some people who supported the communists, and there were an awful lot of people who just wanted to be left alone. But they imagined if they could attack enough places all over South Vietnam that the people would rise up against the government of South Vietnam. So they launched an attack at more than 50 cities all over South Vietnam. Cities and towns, military bases, all the full length of South Vietnam, within a matter of a few hours at the beginning of Tet in 1968. Now, because they had in the past observed a ceasefire, many people in the South Vietnamese Army, the South Vietnamese police, and even the American military assumed it would be a period of peace. And they were on vacation. They were on furlough from their bases and things to see their families. And instead, fighting erupted all over South Vietnam. And it was a mess to get it under control. But in most places, it was gotten under control within a day. So we cannot say the Tet Offensive was some striking military victory for North Vietnam or the Viet Cong. It wasn't. Most places, after some chaotic hours, the enemy forces were beaten back by the South Vietnamese and Americans. But two things went especially badly. One of them was in Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. And there, they, of course, launched a lot of attacks around Saigon. And it created the feeling for press, for reporters in Saigon, American reporters, other Western reporters, that the city was just being blown to pieces. That wasn't true, but there was fighting in many places. It was on a small scale almost everywhere. But it created the feeling that they were under a massive attack. And unfortunately, one of those attacks was on the American embassy. Viet Cong guerrillas blew a hole in the wall of the embassy compound and got in and started raising heck with machine guns. They killed a few of the Marine officers there. They shot up buildings. Now, in about an hour and a half, the Marines had killed them all. So this was, I guess, a victory for the American forces. But there were reporters in that compound who got footage of this. And it was broadcast all over the news. Viet Cong guys tearing our flag down on our embassy in Saigon. American troops cowering outside their ambassador's house, shielding themselves and trying to fight back over the wall. It looked terrible. So what happened at Tet, the Tet Offensive, was a shattering of almost any American hopes the war was going to be over soon. And the president and other American leaders had been telling the American people, there's light at the end of the tunnel. We're getting a handle on things in South Vietnam. We're winning. We're killing lots of them. Remember the hunt and search and destroy strategy? We're killing lots of them, and soon we'll have victory. And then suddenly, all over South Vietnam, there's chaos. Clearly, we are not getting a handle on things. Yes, we won battle after battle during the Tet Offensive. Yes, you could call it an American victory if you want. But the American public said, you told us we were going to win this thing fairly soon, and we can't control a single city in the country securely because the enemy can still attack every single place. There was also, I have to say, 2 places in the far north where the North Vietnamese regular army attacked. One was the traditional capital of Vietnam, Hue, full of beautiful medieval buildings, and they seized it and shot thousands of people who worked for the Vietnamese, Southern Vietnamese government and the Americans there. They executed them by shooting them in the head. They captured and held much of the city. U.S. Marines had to go in by the thousands and fight them out. It took a month of bloody fighting to get them out of Hue. So that was not a case where we fought back quickly. Also, at the beginning of Tet, an American air base called Khe Sanh, American base called Khe Sanh near the North Vietnamese border, was surrounded and attacked, and it took a couple of weeks for us to beat them and get help to those men trapped up there. And those stories continued on the national news for about a month after the Tet Offensive began. So the American people who had been told we're winning, we weren't winning. There had been protests against the Vietnam War before 1968, but after the Tet Offensive, they mushroomed. Protests by the hundreds of thousands became normal inside America against the Vietnam War after Tet. It really did shatter the confidence of a lot of Americans that we could win there. So one of the things I would remind you of is that Tet was a catastrophe for public relations. The other thing I would remind that came out of Tet was a change in strategy, because clearly search and destroy as we were doing it wasn't working. After this, the American policy will become Vietnamization. In other words, we want to go home. The American people will not support an indefinite stay here where we're clearly not getting the job done the way they want. We need to hand this over to the South Vietnamese more. So for the next 5 years, Americans will begin to slowly draw down their numbers and try to hand things more over to the South Vietnamese to fight the communists. That will not go very well. 1968, though, had more problems. It wasn't just America. All over the world, 1968 would see student unrest at universities. Radical students who wanted revolution, who wanted to change the entire socio-political economic basis of their country, rose up in mass student demonstrations, sometimes violent, in Paris, in London, in Mexico City, in Prague, Czechoslovakia. There were lots and lots of student protests, sometimes violent, and in some countries joined by labor unions who went on general strikes. That's where every member of the union refuses to do any work at all. And in the case like Paris, general strikes can shut down entirely the French economy, almost entirely. And so in the late spring and summer of 1968, you saw that going on around the world. But you also saw in 1968 the beginning of violence on American college campuses. You had protests against the Vietnam War that ended up with ROTC buildings being burnt down. You had, at Columbia University, an Ivy League school in the heart of New York City, students with guns taking control of the administration building, demanding fundamental changes in the way their educations were conducted. You had Berkeley, California, UC Berkeley, student uprisings that seized many of the buildings in the heart of campus and shut down education for weeks, demanding free speech zones and creation of African American studies programs and women's studies programs and all kinds of things that were supposed to foster a making of a different kind of America. And so you had the violence or the threat of violence in these student protests here in the States too, creating, again, more sense of chaos. You had the hippies reach sort of their peak in 1968. These young students, mostly white teenagers, early 20s, tuning out of American society, dropping out of the norms expected of Americans, trying to live communal lifestyles, experimenting with drugs. You know the hippies, right? Well, the 1968 would be the summer of love in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, a kind of capital of hippiedom. Again, claiming to represent a new way to live in the world without capitalism and liberal democracy and all that kind of stuff, more anarchic, free, adding to the feeling that something was coming unstuck in America in 1968. But violence came to American politics in 1968. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by James Earl Ray in Memphis, Tennessee. He was shot and killed on a balcony of a motel while giving a speech. And in many American cities with large African American populations, there was violence, there was rioting in the Watts section of Los Angeles, in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan. African American neighborhoods burned as people so upset about King's death took their frustration out in destroying their own neighborhoods. Martial law had to be declared, National Guard troops brought in to impose order in American cities. And then in June of 1968, remember it's a presidential election year, another assassination, but I have to add something else. Some very, very rare thing happened. After Tet, after the growth of these massive anti-war protests, Lyndon Johnson looked at his chances of winning the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1968. He could have run for election again. He had only served 3 years as vice president, only 1 year on the John Kennedy's term, so he could have run for re-election in 1968. But he held off making the decision, and a nobody senator named Eugene McCarthy won the primary in New Hampshire over his name on the ballot. The only thing that Eugene McCarthy had going for him is he opposed the Vietnam War, and Johnson was for it. So it was clear that this was going to be a major problem for Johnson to win the nomination in the Democratic Party. So he shocked the world by announcing in May that he would not seek and he would not accept the nomination of the Democratic Party for another term as president. This is extremely rare in American history. Presidents almost always get the nominations of their party for re-election. It is virtually unheard of to have a serious challenger. Jimmy Carter would be challenged later in 1980 by Ted Kennedy, but he beats him. But it's very rare to get a serious challenger to a sitting president inside your own party. But Johnson was afraid he couldn't get it. He withdrew his nomination. Bobby Kennedy, former Attorney General, younger brother of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, it jumped into the race when Johnson dropped out. And he quickly became a favorite. Eugene McCarthy was still polling pretty well because he was seen as sort of authentic and a real opponent of the Vietnam War. Well, Kennedy also implied he would end American involvement quickly in the Vietnam War. He also was very liberal on a lot of social policies, but he did well in several primaries, and he might very well have won the nomination. But after winning the California primary, as he was leaving his victory speech in California, a man named Sirhan Sirhan shot him in the kitchen. He was being snuck out the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He was gravely injured, died the next day in hospital. So John Kennedy's younger brother, Bobby, was assassinated. Leading presidential contender. It reminded everyone of his brother's death. This was another terrible blow in 1968. There was much feeling. Riots, defeat on the battlefield, or at least perceived defeat on the battlefield in Vietnam, political assassination. There were constant stories about crime going up. Many people thought 1968 was a horrible year in the United States. And around the world, it was not a good year. At the end of that year, though, there was a note of hope. Apollo, I think it was Apollo 10. No, Apollo 8. Circled the moon. The first human beings to circle the moon. It would be Apollo 11 in 69, July 69, that would land. But the Apollo mission circled the moon and broadcast back on Christmas Eve a reading from Genesis 1. And many people thought this was a horrible year, but at least there is a hope. Maybe mankind can do things. Maybe we can still accomplish things. Maybe we can still know the love of God. I mean, it was a bad year, but that was one minor high note that humans circled the moon. They would land there the next year. God bless.